made waves on both sides of the Pacific when it came out a couple years ago. Tim is also chair of the Copenhagen Climate Council, which is a group of business leaders and scientists with their eye on the upcoming UN Climate Summit in Copenhagen. Tim was Australian of the Year in 2007, and he's here to talk about his new book, Now or Never, Why We Need to Act Now to Achieve a Sustainable Future. Alors, je suis Dale Marshall de la Fondation David Suzuki. J'ai avec moi Tim Flannery, un scientifique et auteur de The Weathermakers. Il est membre du Conseil sur le climat de Copenhague. C'est un groupe d'affaires et de scientifiques qui garde un œil sur les développements jusqu'au sommet de Copenhague au mois de décembre. Tim était Australien de l'année en 2007 et il est ici pour parler à propos de son nouveau livre, Now or Never.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for being here this morning. I should just begin by saying that Now or Never, my book, is really a tract in the 19th century sense of the word. It's an argument meant to a particular purpose, and the purpose of that tract is really to lay out the case that we stand at a pretty critical moment in history in terms of our relationship with the environment. And the diacritical point, if you want, that this moment in history will resolve itself around is the Copenhagen meetings later this year in December, when the governments of the world will come together to try to broker a new deal on climate change and how to address climate change. Lord Stern, who was chief economist at the World Bank, has said of that meeting that it's the most important meeting to take place since World War II. And many people, I think, agree with him. As of October, I must say that I'm concerned that progress in the negotiations has been insufficient to broker an effective treaty for us. It is impossible to call the outcome as of now, but we know that the groundwork that's been done has been insufficient to permit a detailed treaty to be brokered at that point. That doesn't mean we won't get an agreement, an important agreement that'll be built upon later, but nevertheless there is concern that things are going all too slowly in those negotiations. I chair a business group, a business council called the Copenhagen Climate Council, and I can tell you that there is a broad concern in business around the world, from places as diverse as China, the United States and Europe, about that insufficiency of progress. Our council held a World Business Summit in May this year in Copenhagen. It was probably the largest business meeting to deal with climate change. It's happened so far, with 800 high-level CEOs in attendance. And subsequently, we have played a role in UN Climate Week, where 100 heads of government came together in New York to discuss the issue. And with our CEOs, business CEOs, leading discussions through lunch, roundtable discussions on various aspects of climate change. That meeting was a particularly important meeting, I believe. It built a sense of collegiality among world business leaders, but most importantly, informed them that even the CEOs of large companies, polluting companies such as Duke Energy, Alcoa and so forth, are urging politicians on to a successful outcome at this meeting in Copenhagen. It is now being recognised widely that this is a very important moment in our history and that we have to rise to the challenge. From an international perspective, I have to say that the Canadian government so far has been playing an unhelpful role in those negotiations. We desperately need Canada to play a much more positive role in the coming months. Canada is an important country with important obligations and a very significant potential to play such a role. Its commitment to doubling aid in Africa was a very important element in the response and could be built upon to deepen that engagement with Africa within the context of the climate treaty and start delivering the kind of flows that are going to be required for adaptation in places like Africa, and also in terms of capturing carbon through protecting forests in that region, a vital role and a vital aspect of any global treaty. Making progress, however, is also going to mean that Canada needs to get its domestic policies in order. It's concerning to see the Canadian government say that it will follow the US lead in terms of carbon trading and so forth. But then we enter a period of lull where there is very little activity to follow that up. The Waxman-Markey legislation in the United States will be enacted within 12 months of it passing the Senate. Time is exceedingly short for Canada, with its very different economy and very different approach to this problem, to be able to follow the lead of the US in any meaningful way. You desperately need the legislation working through now as to how you are going to implement a carbon trading scheme within the context of this Canadian economy, and time is critically short. There are things happening in Canada, though, that gives me sign of hope. Bill C-311, your Climate Change Accountability Act, will hopefully pass through committee sometime later this month. It will commit the country to emissions reductions on the order of 80% by 2050, with various targets between now and then. It has already passed through your Parliament on a previous occasion because of the calling of an early election, wasn't made into law. Was supported by all three minor parties in the Canadian Parliament. I believe Bill C-311 gives, or will give if it passes, the Canadian government and people, renewed credibility at this critical moment before we engage in the negotiations in Copenhagen. We all too often mistake the nature of those negotiations. In Copenhagen, we think of them as being concerned with some sort of environmental treaty. That is far from the case. The negotiations now ongoing towards the Copenhagen Agreement are in effect diplomacy at the most profound global level. They deal with every aspect of our life, and they will influence every aspect of our life, our economy, our society, our relationship with the developing world, our relationship with the environment as well. And we know that a failure of diplomacy often leads to conflict. We know that from human history. And if there was ever a case of a potential failure of diplomacy with the potential to lead to conflict, it is this issue that we debate in Copenhagen. The triggers are all there. Food security, mass migration of people, breakdown of law and order, dramatic changes in our environment. Any one of those could represent a trigger to conflict. Not that conflict will break out if we fail at Copenhagen immediately. It may not happen within 5 years or 10 years, but within 20 or 30 years. I think it becomes increasingly inevitable that a catastrophic failure to agree on how we deal with climate change will set us at each other's throats. The Canadian government is largely isolated in its stand vis-à-vis the Copenhagen agreements. It would be tragic, I think, to see a country like this standing in the way of agreement for such an important issue, particularly when the crop that we will reap if we fail is such a bitter one. Thank you very much.
So let me just take a couple minutes to just outline where I think the gaps remain with respect to what's needed in Copenhagen. I've been following the UN negotiations for 5 years now, and we're less than 2 months away from that ultimate summit. There are 3 major holes, gaps that need to be filled to have an ambitious, fair, and legally binding agreement. To have an ambitious deal, we need industrialized countries to take on emission reductions at the top end of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's range of 25 to 40%, so at least 40% reductions, and all countries should be within that range, including Canada. To have a fair deal, there needs to be financial support for developing countries in their efforts. We agreed to do that 2 years ago in Bali, and major developing countries have put plans on the table, and yet the developed world has not come forward with concrete measures to do that. And to have a legally binding deal, it has to involve the Kyoto Protocol, coupled with some sort of new treaty to take into account the new actions that are going to come from major developing countries. It's unacceptable at this point to be doing away with the one legal instrument we have. And these gaps need to be filled by national capitals. They won't happen at UN negotiations. They'll happen in Ottawa and Washington and London.